Yep.
Okay, comrades. First of all, welcome to today's meeting. We are going to be a little bit depleted. Hopefully, it's only going to be a temporary thing, but we know that there are comrades that have other conference on elsewhere. It's overlapping, and hopefully they'll join us later. But in the meantime, we have a very important issue to discuss. Comrade Kieran from the north of Ireland is going to give a report and perspectives on what is developed in Northern Ireland over the past period and what lies ahead, particularly what lies ahead from the point of view of the working class. After a 30-year war, which eventually ground to a halt, and I regularly identify it as when the IRA surrendered, because after a 30-year war of liberation, not one square inch of territory was liberated, and things just ground to a ceasefire. Nevertheless, political establishments were put in position, and as long as there was a majority representing the old order, the old unionist order in its various guises, it was able to do business. Then, because of electoral situations representing the sectarian divide, the balance changed towards those from a Catholic background, which was again represented by a nationalist Republican change in that little parliament. It then became an opportunity for loyalists, or not, sorry, for nationalists to take over the running of the state. Now, running of the state is something that has to be qualified because it's effectively run from London. They just administer it. But for the past 2 years, it has been suspended because the old regime, represented by the Democratic Unionist Party, did not want to share power and used devices to stall it. In the last month or two, they have withdrawn their objections and agreed to participate and set up a new administration. But it's historic in its own right. It is the first time that a nationalist is running or is the lead representative of the regime. These are the sort of issues that Kieran is going to flesh out because he has a terrific understanding and experience of it. And I don't just say that just to flatter cap, it's a fact, it's a historic fact. Over to you, Kieran. I see that I'm telling the truth about you.
Yeah, how long, Jimmy, do you think for the introduction? 20 minutes?
Roughly.
Should be about right.
Okay, yeah. Okay, well, thank you for the introduction. Everyone here, I think, has some sense of the history of Northern Ireland and what Jimmy's already referred to. The period known as the Troubles came to an end, firstly with the 1994 parliamentary ceasefires, but then more importantly, the signing of the Good Friday or Belfast Agreement in 1998, which was then endorsed by the twin referenda, North and South. And the Good Friday Agreement brought in a very complex political arrangement with North-South structures linking Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland, East-West structures linking Northern Ireland and the South of Ireland with GB, Great Britain, United Kingdom government. But most importantly, a very complex system of governance within Northern Ireland, which means that power sharing between the major parties representing the two communities, so the largest Catholic party and the largest Protestant party, is an obligation, has to happen. Without power sharing between the two major parties, there can't be any devolved government. It's a system, a political approach based on a theoretical approach, which I've actually addressed in an article I've just published, which you can maybe link to, comrades, afterwards, because it's based on the same model as was used and applied in Lebanon in 1943. And obviously we all know that arrangement in Lebanon went through a major crisis in 1958 and then collapsed completely in 1975 into a civil war. But despite that being the best known application of the political theory, which is about accommodation between political elites, but accepting that division remains on the ground, the same model was applied in Northern Ireland, in the north of Ireland, by the British ruling class, with the support of the ruling class in the south of Ireland and internationally. It is not a solution. At the time, socialist Marxists said it was not a solution, would never be a solution. But of course, the vast majority of working class people saw it as preferable to conflict. If the alternative was a continuation of the Troubles or a return to conflict, perhaps even worse conflict, then the majority of working class people voted for it. There was a distinct difference, of course, in that the large majority of Catholics voted for it, but only a narrow majority of Protestants, because of problems that they saw, certain concessions that they saw that were unacceptable to them. It's not a solution, but that didn't mean that socialists at the time, Marxists like myself, called for a no vote in the referendum. We called for a yes vote, now a heavily qualified yes vote, precisely because to call for a no vote would be place ourselves, for socialists and activists to place ourselves on the side of the most reactionary elements within society. And also because we recognised that a period of peace would open up possibilities for class struggle, and a period when the local parties were in power would be advantageous, because that would mean the parties could no longer, from sidelines, say they would do A, B, or C. They would actually be in power, which means that they would, because they base themselves on the capitalist system, they would implement capitalist policies and they would expose themselves over time. So that's why we called for a yes vote, but at the same time we pointed out all the inherent contradictions in the agreement. We pointed out that breakdowns were inevitable. We pointed out that there'd be no long-term economic dividend, the peace dividend which was promised, and that in the long term there was a race against time, either to provide a real solution through the development of independent class politics or a return to conflict. Now, the agreement was signed in 1998, so it's nearly 26 years ago, but the power-sharing government has only actually been in place for about 60% of that time. It had broken down repeatedly. It broke down for 5 years between 2002 to 2007. It broke down between 2017 2020 for 3 years, and then for 2022 to 2024 until now for a further 2 years. 5 out of the last 7 years has been no government. All 4 of the major parties, so not just the DUP and Sinn Fein, but also the SDLP, the second party of nationalism, and the UUP, the Ulster Unionist Party, the second party of unionism, have all at one time or another brought the power sharing agreement down. But it's inherent within the system that every time there's a major contradiction between the communities, it becomes a zero-sum game, and one side wins and the other one loses. And then the temptation is to exercise the veto that the major parties have and to bring it all to an end. And this, of course, is what happened 2 years ago when the DUP walked out over the post-Brexit arrangements. Now, Jimmy just made the point in his introduction, is that they didn't want to share power. I think there was an element of that. There was an element of being cautious after the victory of Sinn Fein in the previous election, which meant that Sinn Fein were entitled to the First Minister's position. Michelle O'Neill would take that. But I don't think there was ever a majority opinion within the DUP that they would not allow that to happen. That was alleged. It was alleged by nationalism that they simply didn't want it to happen. And that's why they really brought it down. The actual reason they brought it down was because of the post-Brexit arrangements. Now, the post-Brexit arrangements, it's very complex, but essentially what it meant was that because there was an unwillingness to harden the border between Ireland, north and south, the land border, by putting in any new checks, there was an agreement instead between the European Union and the United Kingdom government to introduce new checks on what became known as the sea border. So trade moving between Northern Ireland and the rest of Great Britain, England, Scotland, and Wales. That became the crunch issue. But it wasn't, of course, just about trade arrangements. It's about identity. For the majority of Protestants, the large majority of Protestants, that was a threat to their identity. Because if you hold that you live within a United Kingdom, how can it be an internal border within the United Kingdom? How can that be acceptable? The DUP walked out, and it shouldn't be forgotten, and I think it often is forgotten by commentators, in particular nationalist commentators, that the DUP had the support of the majority of Protestants for their stance. The large majority did not want to go into power sharing until the issues had been dealt with. The DUP have now gone back, and they have the support of the majority of Protestants for going back, so that they've won the argument for the moment. They went back with certain concessions. Some of the barriers have been decreased or diminished, so there are fewer barriers, and in that sense, the sea border is less visible. They went back with a 3.3 billion uplift in the Northern Ireland budget, which they claim credit for, but of course a lot of that was money. It was in waiting, finance was in waiting for whatever was going to happen next. So it's, they can only claim so much credit. They've also claimed that there will be new legislation going through the British Parliament, which will copper fasten the link between Northern Ireland and Great Britain, and in that sense would, from their point of view, would take away the sting of the sea border. But of course, the greatest thing that the DUP achieved, the greatest victory, was to be listened to, because 2 years ago they were told there's no alternative. You have to accept these arrangements. European Union will not renegotiate, but they were able to obtain significant concessions during a process of negotiation, and in that sense they won a victory, and that they had to be listened to, and that they made the point that without them forward progress is very, very difficult. Now, the majority leadership of the DUP under Jeffrey Donaldson is very much behind this new arrangement, but there is a significant minority based around the members of Parliament in Westminster, including very high-profile figures like Ian Paisley Jr., the son of Ian Paisley, and Nigel Dodds and others, who are completely opposed to the current arrangements, completely opposed to going back, but for the moment are sitting on their hands. For the moment, they're biding their time. We know, and I think most people know, including the majority of working people in Northern Ireland, that the system is prone to fracture and will fracture again. It could fracture on the question of the post-Brexit arrangements. The new framework is called the Windsor House Framework, and the Windsor Framework is structured in such a way that if 30 members of the Legislative Assembly, so 30 members of the Northern Ireland Assembly, object to any changes in the rules, which mean that they see Northern Ireland moving apart from Great Britain, from the rest of the United Kingdom, in terms of, say, it could be anything. It could be new regulations about toys, with children's toys. And if the new regulations with children's toys are brought in Europe and are then adopted by Northern Ireland in order to stay within the trade arrangements of the European Union, but the same regulations with children's toys are not adopted in Great Britain, then they could object. They could say that this is a threat to our identity, we object, and then a very complex system of negotiations is kicked in. So the temptation will be for them to do that at some point, and that could be weeks away or months away, but it will happen. And then it will depend on the issue, it'll depend how the different forces react, but it is very likely that there will be increase in tension, increased political pressure, and always the possibility of the DUP walking out again. Now, of course, a further breakdown could come in an unexpected issue, could come in something none of us predict. When Sinn Fein walked out in 2017, the initial issue was around a scandal around renewable heating, a financial scandal, which then became a secondary issue in the Irish language, became a more important issue, and the system went down for 3 years. But the point is, further fractures, further collapses are very, very likely. So how am I doing, Jimmy, time-wise?
You're okay.
What, many minutes?
Yeah, you have another 10 minutes or so.
Another 10 minutes, okay. So in all of this, what of the workers' movement? Because the news about Northern Ireland, about the North, seldom mentions the workers' movement. And first of all, what do you mean by the workers' movement in Northern Ireland? Like most countries, but even more so, there has been no party of the working class, no social democratic party, even in a distorted form, or no large mass communist party for 2 generations. The Northern Ireland Labour Party was a mass party. It gained 100,000 votes in the 1970 general election, but then it disappeared by 1974 because it took a non-class position and took a one-sided pro-unionist position. So the workers' movement in Northern Ireland is the trade unions. And the trade unions in Northern Ireland, there's a higher union density than there is in south of Ireland, England, Scotland, or Wales, or most of Europe. There's a much higher union density, of course, in the Scandinavian countries for particular reasons. But outside that, Northern Ireland has a high union density at 43%. Now, most of the trade unionists, as in most parts of the globe now, are in the public sector. And the public sector here is particularly large for historic reasons. But nevertheless, it is a large trade union movement with very particular traditions and with unusual structures. And by that I mean that there is a Northern Ireland structure for the trade unions, there's an All Ireland structure for the trade unions, and some of the trade unions are also involved in the British unions. And that's because we have four types of unions. We have unions that are based in Northern Ireland only unions. We have Irish unions that are Dublin-based unions with a Northern Irish membership. We have trade unions that are British unions with a Northern Irish membership. And we have at least one union, Unite, which could be genuinely described as an international union. It does describe itself as an international union because it is members Ireland, England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And the structures mean that if you're an active trade unionist in Northern Ireland, say from a Catholic background, you could be attending meetings of your union in England alongside English, Scottish, and Welsh trade unionists. Or if you're an active trade unionist from a Protestant background, you could be involved in union meetings across the border with workers from south of the border, activists. So the net effect is that to be involved in the trade union movement at any level means that there's an awareness and a sense of the need to link with workers, not just locally, but outside these borders. And that's a very important factor. The union movement has always played an important role in the history of the North, especially over the last 50 years. It has a greater social weight, the unions do, than in some other countries because of that. The unions are seen by many workers, many thinking workers, as at the last line of defence when tensions rise, when there's a possibility of violence. There's a turning to the unions, and we've seen that many times historically. In 1969, when the Troubles erupted, the trade unions played an important role in ensuring that the trouble initially was contained in certain areas. In 1977, whenever Ian Paisley, father of Ian Paisley Jr., tried to organise a reactionary work stoppage, mass meetings of Protestant workers in the main factories in the Protestant areas voted against that stoppage, and that was very important in halting his attempt. During the period of the peace process, the 1980s and the 1990s, trade unionists again and again took action in defence of workers' lives in individual factories where factory workforces walked out on a regional basis, where in a local area after a mass casualty event, if several people had been killed, there would be walkouts in the area. And on several occasions by all Northern Ireland half-day general strikes in opposition to the sectarian elements. So the trade unions have a great social weight, and that has continued right down to today, and has been a major factor in the course of the last year and a half. Now, there's been an industrial movement here in Northern Ireland in the last year and a half, in tandem with the movement in England, Scotland, and Wales. Same issues have arisen around falling real wages. Often the same unions engage in the same battles, but some of the battles have been very complex because some workers in Northern Ireland, their wages are pegged to wages in England, Scotland, and Wales, and other workers, they aren't. There's separate wage negotiations, so it's complex. But it's been a movement involving tens of thousands across 18 months, a whole number of different disputes, a whole number of different strikes. But all of that culminated on January the 18th, a month ago, with a one-day Northern Ireland-wide public sector strike involving 150,000 workers at least, and 16 different trade unions. The largest ever strike in Northern Ireland, and one of the most significant in Northern Ireland. Now, there have been other significant disputes. So, for example, in 1980, there was a half-day general strike in the first few months of the Thatcher government, which some comrades here will remember. That was everywhere in England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. That was smaller in scale in certain ways, but in other ways it was more important because that was public sector and private sector. It was in the days before anti-trade union legislation, where workers could vote to go out on the basis of a show of hands at a mass meeting. So the major factories, the shipyard and the airport, the aircraft factory walked out with public sector workers. There were major strikes also in 2011 and 2013 during the first years of austerity under the Cameron government, especially around pension changes. But those are all major events, but this is probably the largest single ever display of trade union power in the North. It became a factor in the negotiations which were ongoing at the time between the DUP and the British government. It is beyond any doubt, I think, that the British government attempted to use the pressure of the unions in order to force the DUP back into government. They would go to the DUP and say, look what's happening. And the DUP, of course, because the majority support is working in the working class areas, they could feel that pressure. But in the main, the trade unions managed to maintain an independent position. They didn't take a anti-DUP position per se. They took a position in favour of their members, which meant that they would turn their fire on whoever held the purse strings. At that time, it was the British government under quasi-direct rule. And as soon as the Assembly came back, it is all of the political parties, not just the DUP. Now, that's very important. If the trade union movement is seen to be one-sided, to direct its fire against one party only, then it is lost. And there are figures within the trade union movement, powerful individuals who try and turn it in that direction, just as in the past there were powerful individuals who tried to turn the trade union movements in a pro-unionist direction away from nationalism. So it's very important that that position is maintained. Now, in the aftermath of the Assembly returning, most of the disputes will probably be settled relatively quickly. Concessions have been made. Workers will be given pay rises, bigger pay rises than they've had for at least 10 years. Not sufficient to actually mean that their pay is restored to where it was 10 or 12 years ago, but nevertheless, it will be seen as a victory by most workers. Some of the disputes are likely to become more prolonged because there isn't enough money in the Northern Ireland budget to cover all of the pay claims, so it's likely that some of the disputes will continue. So we're likely to move into 2024 with some putting back on the industrial front. We're likely to see a budgetary crisis because the Northern Ireland budget is far short of the needs, and particularly in health and education. Health sector, for example, we have the longest waiting lists in the National Health Service, much longer waiting lists than in the south of Ireland, longest waiting list in Europe perhaps, and the money isn't there. We'll be moving towards a general election, like the rest of the United Kingdom, either in May, but more likely in October or November, or possibly early 2025, most likely October, November, which means as we move towards that date, that the main parties, the sectarian parties, sectarian blocs, will be gearing up for that election with the expectation that once again they'll win 80% plus of the vote. Because that's what happens in every election. 1/3 of the voters don't vote, but the 2/3 who do vote in the main for the sectarian parties. So the question is, where now for the workers' movement? How do we build on the relative success of the industrial movement over the last 18 months, which has given some more renewed confidence to a layer of activists, has thrown up some new activists, so we shouldn't exaggerate that, but there are some new activists in the workplaces. Has given the unions again a sense, and the activists again a sense that being politicized trade unions achieve more, and what are the next steps? And for us and for others that we are discussing with, it has to be a focused intervention into the general election, meaning a stand in as many seats as is manageable, but hopefully at least 1/3 of the seats, because a stand in 1/3 of the seats means that you get a party political broadcast and you can have a certain impact on events or impact on the consciousness of a layer of workers. That may not be possible. It may just be one seat only, but the idea of standing a slate of candidates under an umbrella title is being actively discussed, and that's something we should look to move towards. In previous elections, we've used the title cross-community labour, and it may well be that that'll be the title again, the banner again, under which we move into this next election. The details are not yet developed, and of course, such a stance, which is a broad, which is a united front approach in effect, has to go alongside the type of broad work in the areas that we have to continue as well, and the specific focused work on winning new people and younger people to the ideas of Marxism, because of course, like this audience here, like everywhere, the next generation are more important, and that we have to begin to win people to the idea that there is an alternative. The current political dispensation will stumble to the next crisis unless an alternative is built, and so we have to begin that struggle today in 2024. So thank you.
You're on spot on time. I leave it open now to any of the comrades who want to come in, either show your hand electronically or even raise it. Ben?
Yeah, I want to begin by thanking Kieran for a very clear presentation and a very clear explanation of the quite complex issues that can emerge. And I agree with the presentation you've made, and I think it's a very complex issue simplified by yourself. And the points I want to make principally around the issue of Sinn Fein. There's a lot of discussion on the left about Sinn Fein and its role in the development of politics in Ireland. The first thing to remember about Sinn Fein is that they are now part of a coalition government with the Tories. We shouldn't forget that the Unionist Party, in all its various guises, Democratic Unionists or whatever, began as what was called the Conservative and Unionist Party, based in Britain. That's where they came from. We should also remember that Sinn Fein itself came from the same origins as the two Conservative parties in the South. Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael were also at one time part of the Sinn Fein process. Now Sinn Fein are in a government with the Tories implementing, or will be implementing, an austerity programme. But there's a couple of, and the settlement, by the way, which Kieran alluded to, the settlement, the Good Friday Agreement, is a reactionary settlement. And rightly, sources would vote yes at the time because the alternative was conflict and killing and bombings. But it's a reactionary settlement. It separates people have to identify as one camp or the other. And exactly as you said in Lebanon, it also happened in Cyprus, where a similar settlement was made between the Greeks and the Turkish population of Cyprus. But anyway, with regard to Sinn Fein and the role that they now play, republicanism, as far as Sinn Fein is concerned, is no longer a radical tradition. It's based on just being anti-English. That's the principal focus of their so-called republicanism. Incidentally, they're going off to the White House on the 17th of March, which is Patrick's Day, to meet Joe Biden, who is one of the principal encouragements behind the campaign of genocide being conducted by the Israeli government, because the United States supplies the weapons. Sinn Fein will be in the White House, shaking hands and cuddling up to Joe Biden. That will cost them in terms of their public image. Now, in the south of Ireland, which I can only refer to, which I'm most familiar with, where I live, the Sinn Fein vote in a recent opinion poll has gone down significantly. Last May, they were on 36% of the popular vote in an opinion poll. The most recent poll showed them at 25%, which is a considerable drop. And there's many reasons for that. I've mentioned one with regard to Patrick's Day, but there's other ones as well. They're now very ambiguous on the question of immigration. A survey found that 76% of Sinn Fein voters believe there are too many refugees in Ireland. Now, that's a euphemism for an anti-immigrant stance. And the Sinn Fein leadership are making concessions in that regard, making conciliatory statements to the right. Instead of challenging these issues and putting forward a principled position, they go along with that general trend. So there's a lot of ambiguity there. They're also preparing to form a coalition government down here now with one of the Conservative parties. They don't care if it's Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael. Incidentally, the terms of these parties are interesting. Sinn Fein means we ourselves, which tells you nothing about the policies. Fianna Fáil means soldiers of destiny, destiny being Ireland. And Fine Gael just means all Ireland. So there's nothing in these titles to tell you anything. But nonetheless, Sinn Fein are preparing to form a coalition government with either Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael, the Conservative parties. And we'll go along then with various policy amendments just to suit that. Now, the point about the Workers' Party is a very significant point that Kieran developed. The Irish trade union movement is united north and south. There's a single Congress of trade unions. Just for the information of the comrades, I was at a meeting recently, just a week or so ago in Dublin, where all the trades councils, north and south, were being brought together to discuss policies. I am myself the president of the Dublin Trades Council, and we had councils present from the north, from Derry, from Craigavon, from Belfast, and in the south, for example, we had the councils present from Cork, from Mayo, Kildare, Wexford, obviously Dublin, and we had a discussion, a wide-ranging discussion, but the principal focuses were on, or foci were on the economy, a second discussion on the issue of housing, which is a problem north and south, and then a detailed discussion about Palestine. But the significant point is that all the trades councils came together in a single forum where discussions took place on the range of issues I've just outlined, and there wasn't a word of rancor of any kind. It was all about finding ways in which we can activate policies that will mobilize the people in a class direction. Now, the issue of spending in the north is going to as Kieran has referred to also, is going to be a big issue. The government in the north is tied to the spending plans of the government at Westminster, the Tory government. We should also remember or note that Keir Starmer has said that should he be elected Prime Minister, which seems quite likely in the near future, he will stick to the Tory spending plans as far as Northern Ireland is concerned. So nothing is going to change between the Tory and the Labour Party in government. Nothing. I need to bear that in mind. The conflicts are going to develop, as Kieran has explained. It's also, I know we keep going back to the point, but this thing about the peace process, it came about, as Kieran explained, from trade union action. A general strike was called before the peace talks began. The Northern Ireland trade unions came out in general opposition to the violence that was taking place on the streets. It was dreadful violence, bombings in the shops, bombings in centres, car bombs, which the IRA developed, which would go off in the middle of a street, plus killings. I remember in the newspapers in the south, most weeks you'd open it and find a dead body or see a photograph of a dead body on the border. The IRA would kill somebody whom they described as an informer, and then the body would be dumped over the border. The IRA would, their agents would drive the person and collect the body and dump it over the border. So that's what was happening. No wonder there was a strike against that in a modern industrial country such as Ireland. So I'll conclude with the point I began with. I think it was a very good opening contribution. I tried to focus a bit on Sinn Fein because there are illusions on the left in Sinn Fein. There was a time when the international organizations on the left, like the IMG, used to bring IRA leaders around Europe to the universities to address meetings, and they put forward this notion that somehow the IRA and Sinn Fein represented the leftward trend in society. It wasn't the case at all. I was myself at the conference back in 1970 when Sinn Fein split between what became the provisionals and the officials. Sinn Fein at the time was moving leftwards, taking up issues about housing and welfare and stuff of that nature. A right-wing group that was financed by Fianna Fáil at the time, broke away and formed the provisional IRA. So that was, I was at that conference. I remember the discussion quite well. I remember the individuals involved in the discussion. So the international organization on the left took some of the provisional IRA leaders across Europe addressing meetings of students. Other Labour leaders were influenced by that kind of stuff, like Ken Livingstone, for example, in London, was influenced. And there's still ambiguity on this question of Sinn Féin representing itself, ipso facto, some kind of progressive force. That's not the case. And that needs to be hammered out, particularly now when Sinn Féin are preparing to go into government, and they will become exactly as Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael began, as Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael are now, and they began themselves as members of the original Sinn Féin party, which, by the way, when it was formed, had a position of dual monarchy, such as was the policy in the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the time. They evolved, of course, from that to become what they are now, a party just waiting to form government with any right-wing party who will agree to include them. But nonetheless, they do have in some areas some left-wing policies, for example, in housing and some other areas, but they're not preparing to implement these. So that they do represent, to some extent, a left opposition or a critical opposition to the present government in the South. But when they start having these talks about a new coalition government, that stuff will all be dropped. They'll make all kinds of compromises to get back into government, just like is happening in the North now with Michelle O'Neill and her colleagues in the Northern Ireland Assembly. Thanks, comrades.
Thanks, Finn. David, see your hand up there now.
Look, as with others, thanks so much for a really excellent lead off. And I think I must also say and pay tribute to the comrades, who have fought against sectarianism, sometimes at great cost to themselves. There's a fantastic tradition. I won't mention the names of people that I've known in the past and present, who've stood against that at very difficult times and in very violent situations. I think that tribute has to be made. And we try and organize are ideas in some ways a simplification. And yet we know that things are complex because God knows the types of agreements that are made are bewildering in the extreme when it comes to the post-Brexit arrangements, to the Good Friday arrangements, and all the rest of it. And sometimes making crude simplifications, is dangerous. But I want to attempt some big questions and open up a debate. And I think it was in '68 we had the Bloody Sunday and the most terrible killings, absolutely uncontrolled British violence by the government of the time, and a horrendous situation opening up, which split everybody, split the working class and the middle class, I imagine, as well, horrendously and box them into sectarian positions. And anyone trying to escape that would be seen as a collaborator and killed, or given the most extreme social isolation and so forth. And I think that many of the youth just simply got out of the situation. I wonder how the immigration to America and to Britain or to London to work somewhere else, you just want to escape the entire mess, because what can you do? There doesn't seem any single prospect. But as I think I remember, our comrades had a rogue position in the during the civil rights movement and thereafter, trying to stop that. But now the decision on where the British violence led to counter-violence. I mean, I've just came across this phrase again by Einstein, that the only answer to organized force is organized force. But that was misrepresented as sectarian force, and the only available organized force was that of the provisionals, it seems. And so, therefore, they rose as a very powerful force in the sense, because they were the only apparent defenders, but defending in the most extreme forms of violence, which of course has a long, terrible history from both sides, in Ireland. And I don't want to go over that. But at the same time, and I think it was you made the point a while ago, Kieran, there is a slow social revolution, so that the attitudes of in Britain towards Black immigration, or to the people who've made it across as workers from the Caribbean in the 1950s was most horrendous violence, racism. But that softened, and we have seen in South Africa and around the world, gradual softening of hostility, the violence that homosexuals have faced, the violence that minorities have faced. I mean, there has been a slow sense that things have to change, and that these ideas that of sectarianism and religion and those identities have gradually mellowed over time. And I imagine that the IRA seen this, and on the Protestants as well, Protestant right wing and the whole mutual sectarian elite, as a danger, as a way, something that they had to fight against. And yet it's happened at the same time through pop concerts or whatever else. It does seem that there's some sort of common cultural identity and a revulsion for the terrible violence that has happened in the past. But what has happened, in the sense, I think we've now had a corrective to my thinking from Finn, explaining that the Sinn Fein can rise and it can also fall, because it's now involved in all kinds of traps. Because it was easy in the past to throw the word socialism around and to present yourself as some avant-garde left kind of revolutionary force. But now they have to face the grim reality that they're carrying out austerity policies, which are hurting their own people, even on their own sectarian device. They're actually acting as the ANC does in South Africa, even prepared to take violence against working class when it mobilizes. So, my question is, has the organization and the reactionary compromise, the Good Friday agreement and so forth, dominantly trapped young people and to some extent the working class politically, not socially, but politically in the building blocks, the bloody building blocks of sectarianism. Or is there a way out through the organization now with the trade unions? I mean, Finn, I have to pay a tribute. That's fantastic to think that the trades councils, North and South, will be able to meet and discuss, and we've been able to put the social issues back on the agenda. I remember hearing one of the DUP representatives saying, oh, well, we've got a settlement now, and now we're going to deal with housing and all the rest of it. I mean, for decades, they forced all those issues and out of the public arena, and have refused to commit themselves. And instead of that, have wanted to carry out, bloody violence against other parts, each part of the community. So, what is the final result of that organized force? Well, are we going to see now, through the working class action and through the slow social evolution, which is an international phenomenon, that youth generally takes on new ideas and softens that disgusting identities which we've been forced into, and tries to extend, friendship, social relations, and class relations, strengthen class relations, across all these divides, and then we can see a political solution arising from the social evolution and the social revolution from below. Thanks.
Okay, David. Any other comrade want to take the floor now? Nigel?
Yeah, I think thanks, Jimmy. I think David makes some very interesting points there, as have all the comrades so far. Thanks for the excellent introduction. Kieran, I'd like to know a little bit more about the left and how it's going to shape in the coming elections. Anti-Austerity Alliance, for example, and how you actually go through the process of working to bring the left together. I think comrades, I'd be interested in hearing more about that. And the other thing is, I think David makes interesting points about the kind of liberalisation of attitudes and views, and that's certainly the case in the UK towards people of difference and colour and LGBT and those kind of things. If you look at the data, it's really clearly that in the last 40 years there's been a tendency towards greater acceptance of people of difference. However, we're in a current situation where that's under threat. In England, I'm talking about. I know much more about England than I do about Ireland, obviously. Well, not obviously, but I do, because I'm from England. And I think one of the problems we've got in England is we've got the move to the right of the Labour Party, not just politically, but also in terms of its social attitudes. It's pro-monarchy, it's pro-patriotism, it's taken, in my opinion, a racist position on Palestine. And although the trades unions, as Finn was saying, I think in the UK have been more progressive and are continuing to be progressive. And, for example, in England, the trades councils, there's a general feeling in the trades councils of support for the Palestinian cause, but the unions have been less clear in their statements, including Unite, which is the union I'm a member of. So they've been less clear, they've been less forthright. And there is a problem, and I've mentioned this before. If the left has a difficulty and doesn't have a very clear position against racism and against attacks on people of difference, it can escalate into a move in the other direction pretty quickly. So they have a responsibility there. And I just wonder if you could reflect on that in Ireland and in Northern Ireland, because I know there's been a lot of problems in Ireland around racism and attacks on migrants and immigrants there. And what's that like in the north of Ireland? Is that similar? Is the picture similar there? Is there a concern about social, I don't know, progress on social attitudes unraveling? Because I think David's making a point that people's general feelings around these things have developed and improved, especially amongst the youth. And I'm concerned about those things being under threat. That's it. Thanks. Yeah.
Okay, Nigel, that's good. Dominic or John?
John.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd just like to say that I'd like to thank the comrade for the lead off on the situation in Northern Ireland. And as far as I'm concerned, having visited Northern Ireland almost on an annual basis since the start of the Troubles, stopping with friends in Derry, there's certain things I think that ought to be seen, that throughout the Troubles, the comrades that I knew, any road, they had very bad times, particularly after Bloody Sunday and internment, in terms of the fact that prior to that, in Northern Ireland, you had the young socialists that were, taking up a program of, if you like, socialism, and the position was one that once you had Bloody Sunday, a lot of the youth were queuing up to join the IRA, because what you had was one particular regiment, the parachute regiment, that had a big incident in Belfast in Ballymurphy, where I think they killed about 12 to 15 people, I think including a priest who was trying to come to the aid of people who were under fire. The parachute regiment then went to Derry and were itching to teach the civil rights movement, a lesson. And what happened was you had a civil rights march against internments, and that was met by bullets, where I think it was about 14 people were killed in Derry. The position was then that the youth that particularly militant had come across and were organising into young socialists, if you like, basically turned their back and said, this is a load of nonsense about talking about socialism. We need to be fighting the British for what they've done. But because our comrades in Northern Ireland had a record of working, for class issues, and particularly in the Derry Trades Council, they had respect even in the darkest of times. If you like, one of the biggest problems in Northern Ireland that I saw was the leadership of militant, particularly Peter Taff and Ted Grant, insisting that the comrades remain in the Northern Ireland Labour Party, which by this time was quite openly unionist. And in the end, there was a split with the Derry Labour Party going independent. But our comrades were put in a real fix by being in militant and being told to support the idea of, if you like, a Labour Party in Northern Ireland, which had become completely sectarian. My own feeling is one, that because, as the comrade said in his lead-off, the strength of the trade unions in Northern Ireland, that was the real powerhouse. And it comes as no surprise that you have an all-Ireland setup of trades councils that meet and talk about, if you like, class issues, housing, jobs, etc. And, it's just that feeling that even in the darkest times, our comrades had respect, because it went if you like, the split in Sinn Fein between the officials and the provisionals, and that they had participated in the civil rights demonstrations, which were brutally put down by the RUC. And because they had that track record of being in the community, they had respect on all sides. I mean, the comrades I know or knew were on first name terms with Martin McGuinness. That didn't mean to say that they in any way compromised to Martin McGuinness and, if you like, the IRA, but because they'd grown up together in the Bogside. And, you know, the position over here in Britain was one of a cringing subservience to Sinn Fein by the so-called lefts, particularly on the councils in Britain. In Manchester, we had a situation where the leadership of the council, which was supposedly left-wing, invited a Sinn Fein delegation to Manchester. Now, I, as a councillor, campaigned against this and said that we should be inviting representatives of the Northern Ireland trade unions, because prior to that, there'd been a big campaign in the trade unions in Northern Ireland, particularly NIPSA, I think was one of them, fighting against sectarianism, because you had, forgive me, comrades, you had on the one hand, in the Protestant areas, the loyalist paramilitaries saying any Catholic worker coming into a Protestant area would be shot. And on the other hand, you had Sinn Fein talking about killing, if you like, people who were, if you like, Crown forces. And NIPSA and the other trade unions pointed out that they were not having social workers, housing officers, benefit workers being threatened, that they were there as workers representing, if you like, councils and other organisations doing their job. And if you like, the paramilitaries on both sides had to back down. And I got a lot of press cuttings on a visit to Northern Ireland, and I distributed them among the Labour group. When it came to the Sinn Fein visit, the only thing on the council agenda was that they would be given hospitality, i.e. afternoon tea. And I opposed this and called for the council, you know, not to do that, but in fact to invite trade union representatives. When it came to, well, I had opposition, believe it or not, within Militant in Manchester, who felt we should be supporting the visit of Sinn Fein. Any road, when it came to it, the Tories opposed the visit, Labour supported it, but then everybody was shouting at me, where are you standing on this visit? And I just got up and I said, I'm abstaining because I'm not voting with the Tories, and I'm definitely opposed to what the Labour group are doing. So as I say, even in the darkest times in Northern Ireland, the fact that the trade unions have been there as a positive representation of the working class has really meant something. So it's not been this horrific thing that comrades were isolated and ostracised, because they were respected because they had a track record. I'll leave it at that, comrades.
Thanks, John. While I'm waiting for some other comrade to indicate, I just want to make one or two very, very brief comments myself. One of the things that's very, very recent, last Saturday night, or Friday night, sorry, there was a TV program on in the Republic, and there was a young band introduced going by the name of Kneecap. Now, kneecap is a very provocative term because it's the tactic of destroying the leg of somebody by putting a bullet through the kneecap, a favourite tactic of some of the Republican and loyalist groups. And it's abhorred and has been abhorred by people with any sort of conscience at all. never mind political positions. But this little band came on the television, and not only was their name provocative, their dress was provocative as well, in that one of them was wearing a balaclava with a tricolour knitted through it. And they were quite a good band. They like, I have no great liking for rap music, but they were lively, they were good, they were entertaining. What was more important than their appearance and their presentation was the fact that they spoke about the difficulty they had. They were coming from a Catholic area, from a Republican area. They spoke the Irish language, again, deliberately so. But they spoke of being in Sandy Row, a loyalist area, which was considered to be a hard area in the 90s. And I had a personal experience of being intimidated out of Sandy Row when I was up there looking for work at one time, and a guy whispered in my ear that it'd be a long time lying in a laneway before I'd be found. So a thing like that kind of sticks in your memory. But these young people were talking about entertaining in Sandy Row and socialising in Sandy Row. And I thought that was marvellous. And they said that on top of that, it wasn't just identifying over the music, it was actually on a personal level that they were able to relate to the youth in that area. Now, I thought that was a tremendous, tremendous breakthrough, that if the youth in what was considered to be a hardline loyalist area are speaking on human terms and on natural terms, and with the youth from the hardline Republican areas, it weakens the ground for the sectarians, but it also opens up an opportunity for the youth to be won to other ideas. Now, that brings on a question then. In the early days of Corbynism, Northern Ireland Labour Party had a rejuvenation, and it started to develop flesh on a very, very mean skeleton. And a lot of young people were going into that party. And one of the issues that was being raised at the time was the question of the trade union links. It was never resolved. And then with the collapse of Corbynism, most of those people left again. But there was a very brief period in it when some leading trade union people were promoting the ideas of Sinn Fein and opposing the idea of Northern Ireland Labour Party having political links. Now, I'd like Kieran, if in his next opportunity, if he could take up the question of political role or trade unionism in the North as either linked to Labour or as an independent role itself, because it's tremendously important. Because after the 1918 election, or in the 1918 election, which is a long way back, emerging Republicans took a position in Ireland that they were going to contest the general election, and they put forward the proposal that Labour must wait. And the Republicans, under the Sinn Fein label, which they had developed, that's actually hijacked the name. They put forward that proposal: Labour must wait, Labour must not contest the election. For 100 years, Labour has suffered in the Republic because of that, because out of that emerged the Sinn Fein, later split, as Finn earlier mentioned, into Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. And republicanism has always dominated, to the detriment in the Republic of working class politics. The opportunity, I think, was lost in the early days of Corbynism, because there was other splits in the leadership of the NALP. But I'd ask Kieran again, as I say, if he could give an update or give an opinion on that. I don't see any other hands coming up just yet. If anybody wants to come in, I'll give them the floor. But other than that, I'd ask if Kieran wants to come back to take up the issues raised so far.
Yeah, thanks, Jimmy. Excuse me. been really good discussion and really excellent points raised and some interesting questions. Some of which are questions that are, they require quite long discussions in themselves, but we can certainly touch upon them. In no particular order, both David and John, just talked about the early days of the Troubles and the impact of repression on the way that the events evolved. And I think that is very important, and we shouldn't forget it as Marxists, with an analysis of the state, in the last analysis being reduced to bodies of armed men in defence of private property. Because it is quite clear, in the early 1970s, the British state decided that they had to smash the civil rights movement, the emerging Republican movement, and they would do whatever was necessary to do so. And just a few weeks ago, like 2 months ago, Brigadier General Kitson died, Frank Kitson, whose name that comrades will remember, who eventually became head of the British Army. But at the time, he was the acknowledged expert, in inverted commas, the counterinsurgency expert, after his experiences in Aden. And it's quite clear that the state, from the very top, decided they were going to go in hard. Bloody Sunday in Derry, of course, where 14 were killed, and John's right, it was 12 or 13 killed in the Ballymurphy massacre in Belfast. There were 6 killed in the New Lodge massacre in Belfast, 6 killed in the Spring Hill massacre in Belfast, where a priest was also killed, just like the Ballymurphy massacre. And there were dozens of other people killed within a very short period of time in ones and twos, either by the British Army in uniform or undercover soldiers in civilian clothes, to deliberately opening fire on unarmed civilians. It's a very clear approach, and it acted in exactly the way that we now understand, and it drove thousands of young Catholics into the arms of the official IRA and the provisional IRA. The official IRA being the left wing, the provisional IRA being the right wing in the split in the Republican movement. And thousands of young potential class fighters either died premature deaths, they died in premature bomb explosions, or they were shot and killed in exchanges of fire, or they went to prison for 10, 15, 20 years. And that was a tragedy. And the guilt for that, the blame for that, lies with the leadership of the workers' movement, the leadership of the then Northern Ireland Labour Party, and of the trade unions. Now, at that time, Marxists within the workers' movement were a tiny minority, but comrades did their best. They did their best in very difficult circumstances. I think the tactics were quite flexible, and we good to talk sometime, John, about the attitude of Peter Taft and Ted Grant to where the comrades should place their forces in the early 1970s. As my understanding would have been that there were comrades are now deceased, like Bill Webster, who would have been very central to the Derry Labour Party. The comrades in Belfast, where the Northern Ireland Labour Party had a defined left wing. Comrades consciously intervened into the official Republican movement until they were blocked because the officials had a Stalinist regime and they couldn't take it any further forward. But the comrades did intervene, and the comrades raised the correct slogans. So, for example, when the might of the military was coming down on the Catholic working class areas in particular, and sectarian conflicts was beginning to break out, the comrades raised the question of a trade union defence force. And comrades, including Finn on this call, wrote the material, wrote the articles, and argued for a trade union defence force. But it wasn't just a propaganda campaign. The idea of a trade union defence force where Catholics and Protestants, through their trade unions, would mount joint patrols to protect the areas had been real in 1969. It had come from the ground up. And the idea of a trade union defence force, including an armed trade union defence force if necessary, was discussed at the highest level in the trade union movement. So workers activists like ourselves can make a very definite difference at particular points in history. I'll come back to that in a moment, the question of leadership. And that's what happened in the early 1970s. But of course, the situation unraveled, and at a certain point in time, the sectarian forces became absolutely dominant, and have retained their dominance down to today, which brings me by a roundabout route to that question that, David, you're asking about. Today, are young people and working class people politically sort of kind of boxed in by sectarianism or changing social attitudes? How much does that matter? How much of an effect does it have? Now the answer is quite complex. I mean, obviously on what we broadly call the social issues, society has changed in Northern Ireland just like it's changed in the south of Ireland and elsewhere. So, for example, not very long ago, Sinn Fein were an anti-abortion party. Sinn Fein didn't lead the drive to achieve abortion rights. They came along in its wake. They saw what was happening, that young people had turned away from them because of their position on abortion. So they came along in its wake. Even the DUP on issues like gay marriage had to give their elected representatives a free vote. They couldn't impose it from the top any longer. They had to allow for freedom of conscience. And of course, they took opportunities when they could have them to allow the British government to impose social change over their heads, precisely because they knew they were out of step with the mass of young Protestants. So there's been a great change in social attitudes, and that is important. And the greater mixing of young Catholics and Protestants is also important. But I think it's very careful we don't get carried away, and many commentators do get carried away, and sort of say, oh, young people, it's troubles in the past. Young people don't think like that any longer. All the evidence is that young people in the last analysis will identify with one community or the other community, their community, in opposition to the other community, which is what sectarianism is. So I identify with my community, and if my community is to assert its rights, it means that we must diminish the rights of the other community. And that hasn't changed significantly. At times it ebbs and flows, but it's very clear, and it's been seen historically, that when the class movement moves forward, this tide of sectarianism flows out, but also vice versa. And the key here is to provide an alternative. Social change in itself will change nothing in reality. It's only providing an alternative. And the alternative must come through an organized political, it must be an organized political alternative. And absolutely central to that is what the point Jimmy was making at the end about the role of the trade unions and the trade union leadership. Now, I've already made the point about how strong the unions are in the north of Ireland, comparatively speaking, compared to other places. Now, we shouldn't exaggerate that either. It's not the same strength as it was in the 1960s, where you have a very vibrant layer of shop stewards prepared to act independently in the factories. We don't have that to the same extent. But it's a peculiar feature of the situation in Northern Ireland, which I doubt is mirrored anywhere else on the planet, probably. The two largest trade unions in the north are led by comrades from, broadly speaking, our tradition. So the General Secretary of NIPSA, the Public Sector Union, which is the largest union, is Carmel Gates, who's a member of Peter Taft's CWI. The Deputy General Secretary is also a member of the CWI. The President is a comrade who would be quite close to the thinking comrades here on this call. The other large union, Unite, which is the second largest union, the Regional Secretary, so it's the equivalent of the General Secretary, is a member of the Socialist Party, of the ISA, and one other official is also a member of the Socialist Party. So at this point in history, where the trade unions have a very important role to play, at least theoretically, conscious Marxists stand in the leadership of the two largest trade unions. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean something? Well, it does have to mean something. We can't just let that moment in history go by. There's a distinct difference between the two unions in that the Susan Fitzgerald, who's the Regional Secretary of Unite, that's an appointed position, whereas Carmel Gates was elected into the position of General Secretary of NIPSA on a split vote. The vote was split three ways, but nevertheless she came through and won that position. So those are very powerful positions, and individuals like that, the role of an individuals in history can play a very important role in the coming period. And those individuals, in particular Carmel Gates and the Deputy General Secretary, played a very important role in the last 3-4 months in ensuring that the industrial action, in particular the one-day generalised strike, was not one-sided, in the sense that it wasn't a strike against the DUP, it wasn't a strike calling for the DUP to go back into government, as if that is the only problem facing the working class, or as if the other parties, meaning Sinn Fein and the nationalist parties, somehow are friends of the workers and the DUP are enemies of the workers. They all pretend to be friends of the workers. They all talk the language of class. Even the DUP talk the language of socialism from time to time, but it's all a facade. We all know that it's just a mirage, and ultimately alternative needs to be built. And that's where it does get complex. I mean, comrades have asked quite complex questions, but it is complex because what we're trying to grapple with here is the question of dual consciousness. That the vast majority of people in Northern Ireland, the vast majority of workers, including trade union activists, identify as a nationalist or a unionist, as Catholic or Protestant, but they have the dual consciousness. They also identify as a workers' activist, as a trade unionist, as a socialist, as somebody who wants to see a different future. And we have to, conscious Marxists, interweave, intersect, and intervene in order to build that layer within society. because it's only a tiny minority would draw the conclusions that comrades like ourselves would draw, that we consciously stand aside from the sectarian divide. So even some of the best activists in one sense or the other are drawn to one side or the other, as we've seen repeatedly over the last number of decades. Nigel asked for more about the left. Now, I mean, the first point to say about the left in the north, again, like everywhere internationally, but especially in the north, it is weak and it is atomized. It's not a strong left. The Labour Party, the British Labour Party, grew under Corbyn from 500 or 600 members to over 3,000 members before shrinking again. But it wasn't an active membership. All members' meetings drew 150 people at most. It wasn't an engaged membership. Interestingly, two of the left formations, the Communist Party, which is in existence since the 1920s, has in the last 2 or 3 years had a split on the national question. And in effect, it's a north-south split. Most of the northern membership are now the Irish Communist Party, and most of the southern membership are the Communist Party of Ireland. And the difference is their attitudes on the national question, and in particular attitudes towards the Protestant working class. The Workers' Party, which is a successor organisation to the official IRA, the split that Finn talked about, they've also had a split in the recent past, which again was a split on the national question, where they lost a large minority who have formed a new organisation and are taking a more nationalist position. Both called the Workers' Party. They continue to fight over the name, so demonstrations are two Workers' Party at times. But the Communist Party don't contest elections, are buried in the trade unions, and don't have a major impact in many senses. The Workers' Party contest elections, but get a very small vote, and aren't particularly involved in the trade union movement at this point in time as they would have been historically. The Social Party comrades will know of, which would be one of the successor organisations, what would have been the Militant, which has an elected TD. And of course, People Before Profit, which is an organisation which on paper has over 3,000 members, has probably got an activist base of 300 or 400, which is formed by and is dominated by the Socialist Workers' Party, who have folded into it in effect. Paul Murphy, TD, and Rise are part of People Before Profit, and it would have a layer of unaligned people in it. In the north of Ireland and Northern Ireland, People Before Profit are definitively, in every way, in one camp. There's no question about that. They are seen by those who vote for them as left nationalist, and they're seen by those who are opposed to them as left nationalist. They might pick up the occasional adherent who doesn't see that initially, but it becomes clear in time. And as the years have gone by, that is, their position is hardened. And they don't represent the way forward, but they do pull in a vote, especially in Catholic working class areas. They pull in an anti-Sinn Fein vote, which would see itself as being to the left, obviously. To me, what's most important is who are the left, and I think the left it isn't defined so much as the hard left and the soft left or whatever other way you might want to look on it. It's the anti-sectarian left that matters. Left-wing activists who are consciously anti-sectarian. And we can talk about what that means some other time, perhaps, because it's you'd have to go into detail around particular issues. But an anti-sectarian left with a clear and conscious orientation to the trade union movement. Jimmy's point. So if you key individuals in the unions, if you've got sections of the unions, people in the leadership bodies of the unions, shop stewards, and conscious anti-sectarian lefts, that's where a new, broader umbrella left organisation will come from, left party will come from. And of course it has to draw in new layers, has to draw in new community activists, new trade union activists, and new youth activists. And again, like in the rest of Western Europe, there is a lack of activism amongst that younger layer. But that's where we need to start. I'm just thinking of other questions I haven't dealt with. Yeah, the Starmer government was just mentioned briefly. The Starmer government will have many impacts, but one thing to keep an eye on is if Starmer does get returned, as he almost certainly will, he has said, he's on record saying he will go back to Europe and he'll renegotiate the European UK trade arrangements, which might well have the knock-on effect of meaning that the sea border, the Irish sea border, close to disappears, and actually might have an accidental effect of taking some of the sting of that particular issue out of the situation in the north, and it become a less controversial issue if that happens. I think I've dealt with both issues. I mean, Finn made some really important points about Sinn Fein, and again, we can't go into great detail here, but it is worth comrades considering or thinking about it, again, for maybe a further discussion, maybe on the south, given the imminence of a general election in the south and the possibility of Sinn Fein entering government. mean, just what are Sinn Fein? Can we now say that Sinn Fein are a bourgeois nationalist formation? Or are they still like a radical, petty bourgeois nationalist, radical formation, radical party? Or somewhere on the journey between. I think they're on the journey between, but very close now to being, in a sense, a standard bourgeois nationalist party, albeit with a history of involvement in armed struggle. In that sense, something similar to Fianna Fáil, who became the party of government, but in 1927, when they entered the Dáil, they described themselves, De Valera described Fianna Fáil as a slightly constitutional party. And the Fianna Fáil TDs went into the Dáil Assembly and into the Dáil chamber with guns in their pockets. Sinn Féin have moved a long way beyond that. There's nothing slightly constitutional about Sinn Féin. They're entirely constitutional, and the guns are long behind them. So they have widespread support in the north because they're a nationalist party, not because they're a left party or a socialist party, but because they're a nationalist party. And if they change their position on issues, the support adheres to them. So they went from being anti-abortion to pro-abortion. They went from being anti-EU to pro-EU. They went from being a party of socialist phraseology to a party which every day parades itself in front of the capitalist class. And they retain their support because they base themselves on sectarian division. That's what they're about in the north. Okay, I'll leave it there.
Okay, Kieran. I just asked if any other comrade want to come in with any contribution or any questions. Marys are very, very shy. Everybody knows all the answers. No. No, if that be the case, Kieran, it seems that you've answered all the concerns, issues, and questions that people have. And unfortunately, well, maybe fortunately, we'll conclude the meeting at this stage. Roger, do you want to make any comments about business ahead over the next few weeks?
Can I
Yes.
just make one further comment, Jimmy? Just to reinforce what I just said a moment ago, which I think it is important. A follow-up discussion about the south of Ireland in the not too distant future, so the two discussions are side by side and can be understood together. I think that would be helpful, given that there will be a general election north and south in the next period. The possibility that Sinn Féin will enter government in the south, not the certainty, but the possibility and what that will mean. I think it'd be helpful, and if we have it soon, so that one flows into the other.
Yeah, I wouldn't see any difficulty with that. And just on the matters of probability, for the last while, the Sinn Féin vote in the polls has been dropping. And this weekend it returns and they're back leading again.
Okay.
One thing about that is that Fianna Fáil, when it was building back in the 20s and 30s, they identified themselves as the party of the people of no property. Sinn Féin, on the other hand, have a more progressive position. They say business has nothing to fear from Sinn Féin. So it's very much a Starmer's position. Roger?
Yes. We can't say for sure what the topic will be next week. We have two possibilities. One would be on the situation in Germany, which is actually a very, very important development in Europe now, with a big strike and collapse in support for the SPD, and for a big, quite a dangerous rise in the racist AFD. So that's one possibility. The other is that there'll be a possibility of a meeting on the new pact made by the EU on the question of immigration, which is, of course, a very important and quite dangerous topic throughout Europe. We don't know which of those. It'll be one of the two, or if it's not, maybe we could have the option of discussion on Southern Ireland. But that might be better near the either just before or just after the Southern Irish election.
Also, I want to call in David to speak about the very important meeting that we have lined up for the week after next, the 10th of March.
Yeah, thanks, Roger. And Kieran, could I give even more weight to the praise that, for your lead off and for the discussion? I'm sorry I've been in and out because I do have a family in visiting. Now, on the 10th, we are organizing a meeting which would be something of a character of a rally, but it has this particular character. It'll be building on the traditions of the anti-apartheid movement from the labor movement's perspective. It'll have leading anti-apartheid fighters from South Africa speaking, including Moses Mayakiso, was the Metal Workers Union. It'll have Rutusa, that is the Dock Workers Union of Durban, present. All of this is convened at one level or other by Jabu Nala, who's an active participant in our discussions, and she's pulling in support, from the Oxford Council, in the sense that those are the Labour Party councillors who'd resigned over the Palestinian crisis and genocide, and she's hoping, and we're working to bring together local councillors, to participate, as well as some of the leaders who have taken up the issue from the west coast of the United States, including David Newton, relative of Huey Newton, and other Black Panther, speakers as well. So it'll be quite an extraordinary event with very many sides to it. The West Coast workers have just had a meeting yesterday, a rally, and are talking about taking action. If we succeed, we'll bring together dock workers internationally, labor councillors through Britain and maybe elsewhere, and the labor movement generally, to focus in on the issues of solidarity and with the Palestinian people and opposition, to the Israeli state and the way in which that war is being conducted against the Palestinian people. So, comrades, please, look out for that note, and let's see if we, how we can prepare. It will be an extraordinary meeting. Can I make one other point? I have to update comrades in relation to our comrade Marcia in Swakopmund in Namibia. Just very briefly, she's had. First of all, let me just put it this way. I want to thank all the comrades who've taken action. It's definitely had an effect. There has been a hearing, and apparently a favorable hearing, but immediately the employers has appealed against this, and poor Marsh is now struggling to be able to force the finding to be made public, or to be able to fight it again and have a further session in the hearing. She's a single mom, has a child, I think, of 9 years old, is living in, I don't want to use the word shack, but in a really impoverished position. And she's so grateful, so very grateful for the support she's had. I'll be putting up, sending out a message or an appeal for further support, which we can express. It's a critical time, because maybe the decision could be strengthened in her favor, because obviously if the employer didn't like it, it must have been partially in her favor. And we could swing it one way or the other. So it's really important we take action. The other action I will be initiating, and I'll ask comrades to look for this, is that Marcia follows our WIN Facebook and the webpage, and I'll put up a message of solidarity, and I'd like comrades individually or representing other groups, to interact with her there. It's one way of being able to interact without being too public, because she is rather vulnerable at this time. So thank you, comrades. Remember the 10th, we'll be having an extraordinary meeting on Palestine at that time. And if you could respond positively and continue some of the marvelous support we've had to Marcia, that would be so much appreciated. Thanks so much.
Comrades, I think that concludes our business. Just one final little comment. I mentioned earlier this app band that was hitting the headlines over their appearance. They've also hit the headlines in that they broke the agreement that the television station imposed on them that they wouldn't mention Palestine. And not only did they mention Palestine, but they advocated support for the Palestinians. And from the feedback I've been getting in the community, it's quite popular what they did. So another little glint of hope for the future. With that, comrades, we conclude the meeting, and we'll see you again next week.